What is the self? The self is, literally speaking, a collection of words to express something in the physical realm. We create a construct of the self in order to perform different tasks or functions. Whatever we call the self is entirely up to ourselves to create. And once we complete that function or task, we then dissolve the self and create a new concept of the self to perform another task. If we don't dissolve the self after we complete the function, then that means doing other tasks that require a different construct of the self is more difficult. In computer programming, we tend to write something like self equals this. And we write a function, we create our own concept of the self, function is finished, it's dissolved. A real world example of this is when you go to a hospital. You go to a hospital, you go to the admin or the reception first, and they ask you who you are. They don't really want a deep philosophical answer or anything. It's very simple. They want the legal construct of yourself. Largely, the law is more focused on the legal construct than the actual physical self. We call this the legal person. It comes from the word persona, meaning mask. It's a false view of yourself that we use in order to do legal issues. In this case, we're talking about an administration hospital. They want to know, do you have the right to be in the hospital? How are you going to pay? Do they have a file on you? Are you a dangerous person? So on and so forth. So we use this legal construct in order to deal with the administration office in the hospital. So then you then move into the waiting area. You have a waiting ticket, and you are now referred to as a number for a short period of time, because that's easier than to just reception, keep announcing people's names and stuff. It's easier to say number 7, number 14, blah 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 blah. So then you move into the doctor, and the doctor is then largely concerned with the physical self and dealing with the body. And lots of people generally relate to their body as themselves, because our language has gradually developed that the end result of the physical self contains the emotional self, the psychological self, and all the aspects of the self in this container. And the language of science and logic, and particularly medical science, is very refined at distinguishing the difference between not just another human being and to another human being, but human beings and other animals and other organisms that aren't human beings and things that aren't even biological, and then, of course, most importantly, different parts of the human being and what could be possibly wrong with different processes and illnesses. But all of this is still a construct of language. Then after we deal with the human body, since most issues relate to smoking, drinking, and eating habits and stress, we might move on to discussing the social self, the psychological self, mind, and then we move on and you finish and you've gone through different versions of yourself, and each time you've had to deal with referring to yourself. In each of those instances, it's a different construct of yourself. Even though you still keep saying that is me, there's still the ever-present feeling of the I. So we have different ideas of ourselves, different constructs, and it stems from the feeling of I-ness. But that feeling of I-ness is still just a feeling that moves and changes. So we've finished in the hospital, we've gone through different constructs of ourselves, and we still have this feeling of I. So we're thinking, well, if I have just described myself in a dozen different ways, and each time I'm describing myself as a different object, then the expression of myself cannot literally be me. It is just an expression, and there is something before that expression. So we have the feeling of the self, but that feeling of the self can change. Because human beings who have mental issues around their memory and they don't express themselves in the same way we do, they still have a feeling of themselves that is not based on their memories or facts about themselves or location. They still have a sense of self. But that sense of self gets dissolved, more noticeably in death. But every night when people go to sleep, the sense of self is dissolved, and the body no longer is taking in so much of an input. It's no longer taking information from the environment. We're no longer going, okay, I have all this information in the environment, but I exist somewhere in it. This little physical body of myself must be in it. I must take care of moving around. That gets dissolved every night. But when we forget, since we don't have the memory of our sense of self being dissolved and what's that like, usually the next morning we forget that the object that we're calling ourselves is literally not ourselves. Whatever we feel is us, it's not actually us. It's just emotional reaction to information that we're processing, and then we make a language construct of ourselves. And the reason why we say that the emotion comes first and then the concept of the self is because that's how the human being evolved. To go really far back, there was empty space expanded, created the energies in the universe, it condensed into the earth, the energy moved around until the energy started to sustain itself, and then organisms came, had these chemical reactions first, and eventually through time the nervous system, the brain developed, and we began to have a better understanding of the world around us. While that process took billions of years, it only takes about 4 years from conception to about childhood where we have some kind of an intelligent concept of ourselves. So, how can we use this information to benefit us? Well, a number of different ways. We use this information to benefit ourselves at the time. As I said, using the hospital as an example, we can change the concept of ourselves to adapt to different situations. And we let go of the old idea of ourselves and just accept that the thing that we're calling ourselves is changing. And we no longer have to be very tightly attached to other concepts of ourselves that people have. Our nationality, our class, our gender, sexual orientation, and the long list of religion, the long list of things that people identify as themselves, because there are people who don't identify with their bodies, they identify with ideas in their heads instead. And when we are attached to these ideas of ourselves, we have a very fixed idea of who we are. Attachment then becomes resistant to suffering, to when the object that we call ourselves is changing. So why do we have this concept of ourselves? Well, evolution doesn't necessarily do things with purpose, in the sense, because purpose is created from the mind. The mind was developed after our bodies or physical or organism began to evolve. So it doesn't really need to have a purpose. It just happens to be so that these random energies and universe moves in such a way, and eventually organisms begin to exist, that the things that happened that prolonged or sustained our existence were kept, because habits that involve our death eventually will get wiped out, because all the people who do those things will die, or die earlier on. So through time, habits that help maintain our well-being are generally kept. So at some point, our body develops the nervous system, the brain, the language center, then the concept of ourself. And the concept of self helps us survive and through time have a introspective thought on ourselves, and defining who we are has benefit to us. But we still need to release and let go of our concept of ourselves on a regular basis in order to perform different tasks. So is there literally the self? Does the self literally exist? Well, if you Google it, the self is defined as something which defines you from everything else that is not you. Okay, so using scientific language, we can clearly define the difference between an animate object, an organic object, and an organic object that has a DNA pattern, therefore has a species, and then each member of a species has a slightly different DNA pattern to every other member of that species, and thus we can find a physical individual. But yet, that's still a construct of language. So, is each physical individual separate from every other individual? Well, that depends on your reasoning. And again, how are you going to construct, how do you define separate? So we have the left hand and the right hand. We can clearly define as different and separate because it's clearly two hands, and one is here and one is there. But that's clearly just a construct in language, because there's no such thing as two. Two is just a word we created to describe a hand and a hand. Because these two hands, well, we can mentally and distinguish between the two. They're part of the same physical body. Just saying left hand and right hand is just language you use. Because if I go to the doctor and I say I have a pain, where's the pain? It's in my right hand. That's easier than just saying I have a pain, or there's something going on and you don't explain what it is. Having a language construct gets us to narrowly point out what the problem is and how we can resolve it. So the left hand and the right hand are clearly part of the same body. But what about the body and the table? Oh, the body and the table are in the same apartment, and we mentally construct the apartment as one object, therefore the table and the body are one. We live in the same planet, we're actually literally in the same physical existence, and therefore we're all part of the one physical existence. But yet there is still separation between things. Well, our physical components are actually largely made out of empty space. So even things that we will define as one object, such as this cup of coffee, because within that thing that we're calling one object, there's more empty space than there is physical things attached to each other. And even within the coffee, we have solid, water, and air, but they're all just different ways we've mentally distinguished the degree of electromagnetism that things are connected to each other. So the cup is has more pulled together than the coffee and the air inside it, but there's still separation in terms of that there's empty space everywhere. But it's still together in the sense that's still part of the same physical existence. And when I say physical existence, I'm including emotion, mental objects, and empty space. That goes back, going back to how this all started. We have empty space. Empty space expands for no particular reason than it just did it. Because it can't create a reason, because the mind doesn't exist, it therefore can't create reason. Energies of the universe being created. In fact, it's not just one big bang. There was infinite number of big bangs going on at the same time and create different parts of the universe, but that's going into a much harder topic that the universe was created. And then those energies began to become more solid, and we've got the earth the energies in the earth started to maintain themselves, become organic beings, going from one cell. Those cells created colonies of cells, created human, and involved emotions, and then built the reason. And then after we developed the ability to reason and the language, we started developing artificial intelligence, computer programming, artificial intelligence to advance the concept of self even further, because human beings are struggling with this concept of self, and so in the future we may need to create an artificial intelligence that can solve this problem faster. So what is the self? The self literally does not exist. It literally is not something that exists in the physical realm. It may refer to something that exists in the physical realm. That is depending on how we define the self. If we define self as ourselves as a physical thing, well then yes, that exists in the sense that it's there, but it doesn't exist on its own side as a separate thing from the rest of the universe. The fact that we divide things up, north, south, east, west, left, right, wrong, that way, this way, here or there, is just ourselves projecting words on top of our experience to make sense. So who is the one who is doing all this? Where is the part that is, well, that's the me that's doing it, the one who's doing, the doer of things, the watcher of experience? Well, there isn't any. Different parts of the body is doing different mental functions and physical functions, and our awareness moves to one part to another. We're able to make changes, and there's a degree of choice, but there is no individual part of us that is watching. There is just information moving into empty space, and that information then begins feeding into itself and starts becoming an aware being. So there is no self. There's no literally one thing on its own that is separate from everything else. But it is a construct of language that we use to navigate through this physical universe in order to enhance our own well-being. So a good daily practice, when you wake up in the morning, be it in bed or you can sit up, you sit there and go, where am I? Just bring awareness to the object in the room that you were calling yourself. And everyone is going to have a slightly different experience. So I'm not going to tell you in advance what's going to happen. But just sit there and go, where is the object in the room that I'm calling the self, and how is it separate from anything else in the room?